Thank you for listening to Gods, Demons, and Magic. This is your host, Sri Satchidananda Das. And we've been discussing the Egyptian mysteries by Iamblichus. And in this ancient text, the Egyptian priest Abamen is describing to the Greek philosopher Porphyry the supernatural world, the cosmic hierarchy of beings, beginning with the gods and ending with ourselves. And these individuals, these supernatural beings, can be contacted through magical ritual or theurgy by using the various symbols associated with that particular being. And engaging in an authorized ritual, one can either come into the presence of that being or invoke that being into one's presence and actually experience and see them and contact them, make requests of them and receive blessings from them. And some of those beings are highly exalted and elevate one's consciousness, such as the gods and archangels or angels, and give one a vision of the divine order within the universe, and ultimately, raise one's consciousness towards enlightenment or perfection or reunion with God. Whereas other beings deal primarily within the realm of matter, such as the daemons or the archons, and will benedict one with material things and absorbs one's consciousness into the concerns of this world, and will give one material benedictions. And so today we're discussing the bringing forth through ritual of the souls of men, of mankind. There's different types of souls of men. There are some which have attained an angelic level of consciousness through spiritual elevation. These are sort of enlightened beings, enlightened humans, spiritual persons who have traversed the path of self-realization and have successfully achieved the highest level of human consciousness. And it raises them almost to the level of gods, and then they can be brought forth and asked questions. And it seems to me that they are considered to exist beyond the realm of matter. So there's a sense in which you can open the phone lines and communicate with liberated souls that have achieved enlightenment. And then there are lower sort of human beings or human souls that exist within this world, and you can conjure them as well. Obviously, they're not walking around in a body like you or I. So pretty much what we're talking about here are ghosts. Humans that exist within on the astral realm within a state of bondage, who've been degraded in their consciousness, and therefore they can, ghosts can also be called forth and spoken to and interacted with. And so, as we've discussed before, human beings are unique in many different ways within this kind of ancient worldview, whereas most of the supernatural beings, they're sort of solidly situated in their nature, and they don't live such temporary lives. They exist perhaps for the span of the entire universe, and they are bound up within the process of creation. In fact, the daemons, for example, are considered to rise from the generative nature of the gods. It's like they're part of the unfoldment of creation itself, and they master and control a certain part of reality, material reality. And therefore they're sort of like intimately locked in within the universe, and universal power, and they remain who they are. And when you summon them, at least the higher beings, you can see their concrete form, and it never changes. That's just who they are. And you could summon them, someone could summon them 1,000 years from now, and they would look the same way, because they don't have a changing form. Whereas human beings, we're constantly changing. We're moving life after life after life. They're basically going through the process of reincarnation into many different forms. And therefore our forms are constantly changing. Each lifetime we have a new face and a new body. And even within a lifetime, we have new faces and bodies, every decade, we look differently. That body that you had as a child that you see in, those old photo albums or something, or maybe you have a folder of photos on your computer, that body's gone, it's completely changed. So what is our body? We don't, obviously we're not the gross physical body because it's constantly changing. So we're like the spiritual essence within. We're the soul. And yet that soul can be embodied in an astral form. You have your gross physical body, which is, as we mentioned, constantly changing. And then you have a subtle astral body, which is a kind of imprint of that. And that's sort of what a ghost is. When you're summoning the ghost of a human, you're summoning an astral body. But then even beyond that astral body, there is a spiritual spark of the soul, which exists previous to coming into matter. It's a spiritual piece of the divine, and it actually comes into the world from the divine realm. It descends into matter, and it's like a spark of God, an eternal relationship with God. And then through the process of self-realization as described in these texts, and especially through communion or associating with the gods of this world, these purified beings which manifest the illumination of the divine into the world, then this spiritual spark gradually can purify its existence and arise to its true spiritual nature. Now, when the spiritual spark is embodied within the lower condition of existence, say within an astral body, then when it's summoned within a ritual, like if you summon a ghost, then all of these different ghosts have many different forms. Like the form is constantly changing because the human being in the world, the spiritual spark of the soul in the world, it has no true form. It's like a chameleon constantly changing and shifting its form and its shape. And so therefore when the soul appears in sort of the ritual, when a human soul or a human astral body is summoned within a ritual, the form is constantly changing. And the forms that you'll see are always different. You may see a Roman soldier, or you may see an old woman, or whatever. These forms are always changing because there's almost unlimited forms that souls can take in this world. And not only that, also this changeable nature, as we mentioned previous in other episodes, it applies also to the ideologies we hold, the political views we hold, to the sort of perspectives on life we hold. You may be born in China in one life, and then you may be born in Argentina in the next. And so you're going to have a very different view of the world depending on where you're born. And we become very attached to these worldviews, and yet for the soul, they're temporary. And we sort of see the world from the Chinese perspective, and we're very interested in Chinese politics. We're very devoted to our nation, and we're furious, if someone offends us. They say that island in the South Pacific is theirs, but it's ours. How dare they offend China, or something like that. And then similarly, when you're born in Argentina, you feel the same way. The Falkland Islands or something. How dare England, consider that island to be theirs? It's ours. So we develop these very sort of like body-centric views that we're very attached to, and yet these views are constantly changing with the change of the body. And we also change our language, we change our food tastes, our culture, our interests. All these things are constantly changing. So we are an eternal spark, but we're situated within a kind of like smoldering fire of constant change, and you might say we're constantly evolving into different creatures and beings. And so therefore you'll find summoning the souls of human beings that their form is constantly changing. And they move around as well. Abaman mentions here that when a soul appears within a ritual, they're constantly sort of like, they move around, and they don't just stand still. It's like the soul is, you can imagine like summoning a ghost, and the ghost is constantly like moving and shifting, and it doesn't just stand there and stay in one place. It's like a gaseous cloud which is constantly shape-shifting. And whereas the other, the gods and other supernatural beings are very luminous and they shine out with tremendous power, the souls of men are not very luminous, right? There may be some slight, luminescence coming, some very, very slight glow, but it's not very powerful. Because within the cosmic order, the embodied soul, or the human soul, is actually very small, and we're considered to be very feeble. Whereas the half-gods, who are sort of the souls of men and gods combined, they move in this very dramatic, passionate, strong, forceful way. They're just like a regular human soul, or like a ghost, for example. It doesn't have that same dignity, that same power and strength, and moves in kind of like a very feeble, sort of weak way. Like if you were to summon a ghost, it's kind of like this smoky sort of moving shape-shifting form that is very slightly glowing, not very luminous at all. You may not even be able to see it very well. It's just kind of partially gleaming with light, and it's moving in a very kind of like weak and feeble way. Like it's not really exhibiting strength, it's exhibiting a kind of weakness or depression or sadness, that type of thing. and they appear to be very shadowy. It's like a shadow, kind of a smoky, sort of shadowy creature has appeared before you. And generally the effect on your consciousness is that it will involve you in material things. So as we've heard with the archons, the lower archons, and with the daemons as well, the lower daemons, when they appear, you become, your mind and your consciousness, your emotions, your senses, it becomes filled with concerns with the things of this world, because that's where they sort of control within matter. That's where their consciousness is absorbed and into which their consciousness is flowing. And so therefore when they appear, your consciousness also flows towards the material because of their presence. You're sort of overwhelmed by their consciousness, and they draw you into the things of life into which they are in charge. And so with these lower human spirits, though, they're not necessarily in charge of matter, but they're just sort of like contemplating it, and they're drawn into it. So you can imagine a ghost being summoned, and it's the ghost of a woman, and she's lost her child, and she committed suicide by jumping off a bridge or something, like the traditional Irish, banshee or whatever, that, she's lamenting and she's crying and she's sad and she's thinking of her child. And it's like the whole room fills with that lamentation and that pain. And you also feel that pain, you feel that sadness, the loss of this child, and she makes you, you might even start crying and stuff, like she makes you also lament, right? So they draw your consciousness into the things of this world, into the things in which they are sort of lamenting or contemplating. And if it is indeed a sort of a bound soul, like a ghost, then they'll appear, according to the Egyptian priest Abamen, they'll appear bound and in a state of suffering. Like we mentioned, this banshee, she's clothed in rags and she's actually crying, right? And you've summoned this particular being in front of you, and you feel this overwhelming sadness. In fact, you see these ghost hunters and things that have these television shows. Oftentimes that's kind of what they do. They walk into a room, and then they, like a psychic or something, will feel overwhelmed with sadness, like they don't necessarily see, like a smoky apparition flying around the room, but they'll just feel incredible sadness and pain. And so that's because perhaps the ghost is present. And when they're actually present, you feel their emotions and you feel what they're concerned with. And so when you summon them in a ritual, you also feel that, and it would come on very strong, Or like if you're just walking in a room and there's a ghost happens to be there, or in the attic above or something, you may feel the emotions from the ghost, but when you're actually calling them forth in a ritual, it's like you're establishing a very clear line of communication. You're sort of opening doorways in between the realms, and so you get the full blast of their consciousness, and Abamen mentions that they're carrying the symbols of bonds and punishment. And so this is very similar to, you see in the Christmas Carol, like Charles Dickens, and you see kind of the archetype of the ghost dragging his chains, right? You may even hear, there's a haunted house, and you can hear chains dragging at night and wailing or something. So the ghosts are considered to be carrying the sort of like the symbols of their suffering, the symbols of their punishment. Because oftentimes they're in that particular form due to performing some greatly sinful act. They tied a woman, and as a man, he raped a woman, then he tied her with chains and threw her alive into a Scottish lake or something like that. And she was, drowned by the weight of those chains. And now this wraith, like Macbeth, he can be seen wandering the Scottish highlands, dragging his chains through the wet mud, and crying and lamenting what he's done. And so this sense of being bound and punished is there, and this feeling of weight. The chains it's an apt symbol, because it's really, you're being weighed down ultimately by their suffering and by their unhappiness. And also they are, as it mentions, they're held fast by the disorders incident of the realm. So it means like the various ways in which they've suffered, you can see that in the manifestation. Like they, for example, say they died in a car accident. You had an individual was drunk driving and went head on into a pole or something like that. And so their ghost, you're going to see that it looks like it's been through a car accident. Say the manifestation appears before you, their head will be split open and their eye is hanging down, and they're kind of like, their body is broken, their ribs are broken, their arms are broken, and they're just kind of standing there in a state of apparent pain and misery. And so, they're these different apparitions. They're not like joyfully standing there looking hale and healthy, right? They're completely overwhelmed by the disorders and sufferings that they experienced in life. And not only that, but oftentimes it mentions they appear with daemons in appropriate order, placing their authority directly before them. So, you have like you summon a particular spirit. Say there's, almost like Dante's Inferno, like you call forth the ghost of some particular murderous politician, and you want to ask him a question. And by the power of ritual, you're able to drive him up from the underworld. So he comes there in chains, and he's sort of thrown down on his knees before you. Maybe he had died from poison. And so you see like his stomach is all distended and bloated, and he looks like, he's dying from poison at every moment. But then next to him you'll see the daemons of the underworld, his punishers, right? The Yamadutas from the Vedic perspective. They're there with the spears and the chains and the whips and everything like that, and they're all standing around him, and they've got their authority on him, like they drive him to his knees, and they put a staff at the back of his head and force his head down, in front of the priest, right? And so they're punishing and controlling him. Like he can't speak unless they allow him, and he can't stand unless they allow him. So there's a sense in which, certain ghosts, at least, they're drawn up from the underworld, and they're it's almost like, when you go into a prison and you ask to see someone, and then the guards, bring them into the room with the telephones and stuff, right? Like the meeting room, or you sit at a table across from them and the guard is standing there next to you, standing there next to them. So that's really the state for the ghostly type of human. And so they're not independent, they're not free. And that's really the nature of the soul within the world, is that although we are a spiritual spark and we are free by nature, we're in a state of confusion and bondage, and we're never really independent from the influence of these higher supernatural beings. Now, as we mentioned, there is another form of human soul, which is a liberated soul who has transcended these particular boundaries and these sort of imprisonments. And so this type of soul looks a lot different. In fact, it's mentioned that this soul, when you sort of bring forth, or I don't want to say summon, because you don't necessarily have power over such a liberated soul, but when such a soul agrees by divine arrangement to appear before you, then they look like a spectacular formless fire, like it's just like a blazing flame of fire, and it's not necessarily held in a particular form. Like it just, this particular like ancient Egyptian or Greek conception is the soul in its pure state being like a blazing fire, just sort of crackling, and not crackling, like it's like there's wood underneath them or something. But what I mean is like shimmering and shaking like a flame. And so, this is their particular conception. It's very interesting because it reminds me of like the various Islamic depictions of saints, like they have this huge sort of an effulgence of fire around them. So that's the idea. And so when these liberated souls appear, then they act as spiritual guides. They'll give you information as to how, and they're not interested in material things necessarily, but they'll give you how spiritual information and guidance, how you can also be elevated and rejoice with the good, or be elevated to a similar condition as them. And it has a sort of jubilant attitude, it's like it's rejoicing, it's happy. It's not just like a flame, it's a flame glorifying God. It's a flame, absorbed in prayer and song, and it's sort of it's rejoicing in its consciousness, and so therefore you perhaps will also feel that same kind of rejoicing. Like you'll feel mystified. There'll be a spiritual ambiance which descends upon you and makes you also rejoice spiritually, and make you gravitate towards God or towards the absolute truth. And so this is the effect of being in the association of a purified soul. And Abaman particularly mentions that it'll make you feel hope. This kind of elevated, liberated soul, it gives you guidance, but it also inspires you with hope that you can do it. But if you summon a lower human or a bound human, sort of like the astral manifestation of a ghost, then it has the opposite effect. It drags you downward into the sphere of generated existence. It fills you with perturbation or with lamentation about material conditions, about bodily existence, right? So the liberated soul is beyond the body. It's just a pure naked soul there, like a divine flame. Whereas the ghost is really concerned in corporeal conditions. It's concerned with material existence, life bound within the body, which is the life that we're undergoing. But he's lamenting, the ghost is lamenting, he's unhappy, he's disturbed and completely attached and drawn into the concerns of material existence, into the concerns of bodily existence, which is ultimately alien to the soul. So it's really the difference between the liberated soul and the ghost is like the difference between light and darkness. The difference between pure freedom and knowledge and total immersion in matter. And it's ironic that, that human soul which is so immersed in matter actually doesn't even have a physical body. Like it's trapped in an astral body and oftentimes, locked in bondage of punishment by daemons, who their job is to actually torture that soul. And so you have kind of like the two extremes of human experience being shown here. The extreme of liberation and freedom from bodily concerns and, this freedom from the cycle of birth and death or samsara, the continuous revolution of material experience. And then you have those which are drawn totally into matter so intensely that one becomes degraded and acts in such a way that they're bound and punished and is, lamenting and feeling tragic emotions towards reality. And when you're in the presence of those sort of materially engrossed astral beings who are experiencing lamentation, you also feel hopelessness. In the same way that the liberated soul makes you feel hope, the bound soul makes you feel hopeless, like there's nothing. This is perhaps why traditionally you see suicide is associated with attaining the body of a ghost, because it is a state of hopelessness. That there is nothing that can be done. My life is miserable. It's ruined. There's nothing that I can do. I can't, I have to just destroy it. There's no use living any longer. And so in the same, this is really that doesn't end with the body. Rather, that continues into the astral realm. And one is always then locked in that state of hopelessness. And when you summon forth such a being, you also feel that hopelessness. And also within this presentation of Abaman is kind of the sense of you become filled with strong material appetites. You desire things in the association with these ghosts. There's kind of like the sense of kind of the Eastern conception of the hungry ghost. The ghost is a departed human that is so filled with desire and hankering and lust and greed and anger and, wants to fulfill its desires within this world, but has no body to fulfill it. You'll see like traditional depictions of the hungry ghost is you have like a ghost with a hugely inflated belly but a very small mouth, like small, like a coffee straw, and therefore he's not able to fulfill his appetites. And so there's the idea that the ghost is also filled with tremendous desire and patience, and in regards to the things of this world and wants to attain them. This is why ghosts try to possess people, right? They want to try to experience through their senses the desires that they can no longer fulfill due to the lack of a body. And therefore they'll sit on top of someone and sort of like try to vicariously experience the pleasures of physical existence. And of course this is all for naught because they can't, they're not able to actually experience it in the way they want to. And therefore the ghost is always frustrated. And when you summon a ghost, imagine you summon some kind of, a man, like a powerful male figure, Jack the Ripper or something, and he's this kind of like dark, venomous personality, and yet he's filled, immediately explodes onto the scene, and he has his desires, get me this, I want this, where's this, how can I do this, and he's trying, just all of a sudden kind of overwhelming you with all the things that he wants and trying to fulfill his desires somehow, desperate, drink, I need drink, like the ghost of an alcoholic, As soon as you see him, he wants alcohol, and he's asking you, just give me alcohol, or he's trying to convince you, please, just sit down and get drunk, and then I'll sit on top of you and I'll try to experience it, right? So there's the sense in which they're also exploding with these material desires that they want to fulfill, and they're also lamenting those desires, and they're filled with these kind of appetites. And so when you associate with them and you interact with them, you also become filled with these kinds of appetites. So therefore, there's that sense of degradation in their association, not just due to lamentation, but due to intense, unfulfilled desire that you absorb that kind of energy. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Gods, Demons, and Magic.